Sharkast. 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 IAA Sharkast.
Hello, Sharkland. Welcome to Sharkast, episode 44. That's correct, 44, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dr. Don, your host of Sharkast. We're so glad that you're here today with us. We're going to start out with some communication items. There's quite a bit to be communicated. First of all, February 21st, that's Monday, there will be child protection courses in English at 9 a.m. And then on Wednesday, there'll be a child protection course in Spanish. That's February 23rd, also at 9 a.m. In addition to that, we have yearbook photos for elementary school on Monday, the 21st, from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. If perchance you are not able to be at school on Monday because you are sick or your family is traveling or whatever the case might be, don't worry, there will be makeup photos on Wednesday, the 23rd. On February 22nd, it is 2/22/22. So wear your tutu. What a great day. Some numbers. February 28th through March 1st is Carnival. All right, coming up. A little vacation, a little break. In addition to that, we have some March upcoming dates. March 7th, there will be no school for students because the teachers will be in a professional learning day. March 12th will be the SAT test. March 17th, that's a Thursday, will be astronomy night. And Mr. O has organized some incredible guests from across the world that are very high-powered in their fields of astronomy. They'll be meeting with us on astronomy night, so that should be a lot of fun. The next day, on March 18th, we have parent-teacher conferences. And at night, we have Cafe Concierto, which is going to be incredible. Our students will be performing for us. Poetry and music and art. It'll be wonderful. So we're excited for that. And then we are getting back to normal life, it appears, because at the end of March 25th through the 26th, there will be an AMISA tournament for boys basketball. And so that's pretty exciting that we're getting sports going again. And in addition to that, we're hoping that everybody is staying safe, continue to follow the protocols. As things open back up in the world, we will continue to be cautious. We will continue to wear a mask. We will continue to take our protocols seriously so that we can wait and see what happens in the world around us. So just be aware that if suddenly tomorrow there were a mandate from the country, not a mandate, but an opening in the country saying masks are no longer required anywhere, that we would still require masks on campus for the time being, just to wait and see and to be cautious and to make sure that we keep people safe, because we have no cases of COVID that have spread from our campus, and we're going to keep it that way for as long as we can. It's better to have our kids here, it's safe and healthy, than to have them not here and enjoy 1 or 2 days of mask-free euphoria, because that would be pretty nice. Those were the good old days when we didn't have to wear masks. In the meantime, we'll be cautious. What about after-school activities, Dr. Don? When are those going to start back up? Don't worry, we'll have our second season of after-school activities sometime in March. We'll send out the information when we have it. We'll have the providers listed, and your kids can sign up for after-school activities. So that will be coming in a couple of weeks. Okay, moving away from our education items, we're going to talk a little bit about a workshop series that Mrs. K and I have been attending on Thursday afternoons called Dismantling Our Notion of Education. The series features Jaime Casap, who was the developer of Chromebooks and worked at Google for a number of years. His topic today is on Generation Z. So let's listen in.
Just a real quick introduction for those who are joining us for the first time. My name is Jaime Casap, or Jaime Casap. I was the Chief Education Evangelist at Google for 15 years. I launched Google Apps for education into the university space, launched Google Apps into K-12. And the craziest thing I did at Google was launch Chromebooks into education back in 2011. And then there's some other stuff that I did there as well. And, when I left Google, we had 125 million users around the world. And I remember when we were so excited when we had 2 million users, and I know 50 million Chromebooks, and that was before the pandemic. So I left last June or whatever year we're in, I don't even know, but I left in June 2020 to pursue some other work focused around some of the work that we're doing here, some of the stuff to dive deeper into the real role of technology in education and not be tied to one platform like Google, but also to talk about learning from the future. Like, what does learning look like in the future? What is that what do we need to do both at not just both, but in K-12, in higher ed, in corporate learning. Anyway, let me start by talking about Generation Z, right? That's a topic that we're going to talk about today. Who is this generation? And what does that mean for education? What does that mean? And for me, I have like this, my own microcosm marketing group that I can talk about. So I think I mentioned this last week, but I have a 29-year-old. These are my kids, by the way. I have a 29-year-old, a 20-year-old, and a 7-year-old. Yeah, I like one at a time. I can only handle one every time. But what's interesting about these three kids is that they are completely from different generations, right? Because they're more than 10 years, sometimes 9 years apart, or more than 10 years apart. And this is a true story from a couple years ago when my oldest daughter, who's a film editor, does film production, does editing, does writing, does those things. She actually works for CNN. She makes fake news. And so when she wanted a Polaroid camera, for Christmas, because she wanted something antique for a shelf, she wanted a Polaroid camera. Right, my 20-year-old, however old he was a couple years ago, said, "What's a Polaroid camera?" And my 7-year-old, who was like 4, was like, "What's a camera?" Right, like that's the difference between the generations. Like, so my 4-year-old's like, "What's a camera?" Right, so because your phone is your camera. So that is the growth of this generation. And unlike other generations, the technology matters a great deal, right? Because what technology looks like matters to these generations because this is the world that they're born into. They don't know any better, right? So for example, think of it this way. All of us are attached to our technology, right? It's become part of who we are. It's, almost embedded into our hands. Some of us, if we could have it stitched into our palm with a never ending battery, we would do that. This true story, a couple nights ago, I went to go see a comedy show. And I had changed pants or whatever. But the point is I left my phone on the bed. And, so I'm halfway to the arena and realized that I don't have my phone. And I don't know how I got there because, how do you drive without a phone, right? How do you drive without directions? Then I got there. I must have phantom reached for my phone 100 times that evening, because it just wasn't there. For every thought that I had, I reached for my phone. It was a very strange, I couldn't remember the last time I did that. But this phone is attached to our hands. It's become part of our lives. We can't live without it. This device, your iPhone or whatever it is that you have, this thing that you can't live without is only 15 years old, right? Like, you drive to work. There's people out here I know, because you drive to work, you're like, oh, I forgot my phone. You will drive all the way home to get your phone and then go back again, right? That's how this has become part of our lives. And if that's true for us, a generation who didn't grow up with this technology, what do you think that means for a generation that doesn't know what the world looked like before iPhones and doesn't know what the world looked like before the internet, doesn't know what the world looked like before Wi-Fi, right? Like, this is just their life, in the same way that our grandparents would tell us, like, oh, you don't know what life was like without, television, right? So it's the same thing from a technology perspective, except it's coming in faster. So I can already see a huge difference between my 20-year-old and my 7-year-old when it comes to technology, where my 20-year-old for Christmas got a, he got a record player. Because he's into vinyl. So he got a couple of vinyl records and a record player. My 7-year-old was just amazed by this technology, right? My 7-year-old doesn't know what a CD is, let alone a record player or a record. Has no concept of a CD. And when she would like take the record and look at it and it's like, where's the music coming? She couldn't understand. Here we are. Last week we talked about talking to kids about technology and them being smart with technology. And here's my 7-year-old who this old ancient analog technology she can't understand because she's way past that, right? So this is what I call the TikTok generation, right? So this generation is a digital generation, full stop, period. And one of the things that we have to stop doing, and I've seen this for years, is I've seen teachers trying to get students to be more old school, right? To be more traditional, to like put the phones away or put the technology away and do something, old school, as if somehow we're going to go back into the past at some point, right? Like as if, one day, all the nuclear bombs in the world are going to go off and we're going to have to like live in the forest and hunt for deer, right? Like that's not happening. And I still see that. I see that with parents and I see that with educators, where we're going to pretend that this technology doesn't exist. And that might have been okay for my 20-year-old generation. And I remember, he had to drop his phone off, at the office before he went into school. And I'm sure there's lots of schools that still do that. And if you really spend time objectively thinking about that, right? This idea that you're going to take a device, right, that literally has all the world's information in it that would help you learn and do anything and make them put it away because you want to do things in a traditional way, doesn't make any sense. Now, try that with any philosopher or anyone in history, right? Try that with, Galileo, saying, listen, I look, you got this device that has all the world's information, but you can't use it, right? Like it's just insanity when you think about it. So what I want us to start thinking about isn't how do we get rid of technology? Because I'm sure there'll be questions about like distraction and, what do we do with those things? And absolutely, we have to like make sure that we're focused on having rules and guardrails and guidelines in place. And we talked a little bit about this last week about how this generation is not very tech savvy when it comes to the important things. And so I want to spend a little time talking about that. But let's talk about, who this generation is with an understanding that technology isn't going anywhere. And then instead of trying to fight the technology, what we need to do is figure out how to take advantage of the technology. How do we use the technology to our advantage as educators? And again, I'm going at this not just from an education perspective, but also as a parent of a 7-year-old who has her own iPad, with a service plan on it, right? And has a Google Home or a little Google Mini in her bedroom that I can't tell you how many times she's talked to this thing, because every time she's curious about something, she goes and asks questions, and how that has led to so much learning. So I look at this as an opportunity to do this. But let's talk about this generation a little bit and who they are, right? So when we talk about Generation Z, we're talking about those kids. We're talking about my 20-year-old and everybody younger than that, right? We're talking about this generation that grew up with technology, that were born around, I like to use the year 2000, right? Because that seems to be the most, it's just one of those numbers that say, this is it's a good number, right? The millennial generation, the year 2000, around, a couple years before, a couple years after. That's who this generation is, right? This generation is the digital generation. And this generation thinks about technology not as an innovation or this magical thing. They think about it as just existing, in the same way that we think about television when we were born as it just existing. And so when we approach them with this idea of like, oh, we need to limit it, or we need to ban it, or we need to do whatever to it, it doesn't make sense to them. They can't compute that because they can't comprehend. Just like when our parents said, don't watch too much television, your eyes will get crossed, or don't watch too much television, it'll burn your retinas. You're like, what? I don't know what you're talking about. Because it didn't make any sense. Like, why would this thing exist if it's going to hurt me? So instead of thinking about technology as this foreign thing, we have to be able to look at this as something that is just part of who they are. Now, that being said, they spend a lot of time online. 90% of them spend time, and this is all, by the way, before pandemic. 90% of them spend at least an hour a day on their technology. Most of them visit YouTube every day. Most of them are on TikTok every day. Most of them are spending what I call non-creative time on technology. They are consuming technology. And I think one of the things that we need to think about this generation is, what is our job when it comes to this generation and how they think about technology, so that we can make them creators and not just consumers. Because if all they're doing, it's our job to make sure that this does not become this, what I call the scrolling generation, right? That they're creating and building things. And we're starting to see some of that shift happen. Now, why this matters is because this generation thinks about everything differently, and they use a technology angle to think about that, right? So, for example, if you think about this generation, and you think about, let's say, a typical, 15-year-old, and again, some of this, we don't know what the impact of the pandemic's going to be on this generation right now. The information and the research that I did is all before the pandemic, and before the pandemic, I've been talking about these things for years as this is coming. So, for example, this generation was already worried about work before the pandemic. 66% of this generation, when in high school, right, was worried about what work would look like. This is a generation that grew up with parents who they watched put their work in, put in their sacrifice, do what they needed to do, show up early, stay late. And they were promised this pension or this retirement or this, future. And they watched their parents put into work and then lose their jobs and struggle when they were 50 or 60 years old. And so this generation sees work in a different way than we see work. You got to remember that this core generation, these like 10 to 20-year-olds, this generation here grew up when our unemployment rate was very, very high, again, before the pandemic. And it took years. It took us like 5 years back in 2008, 2009, 2010. It took us 5 years to get the unemployment rate to under 8%. So you have a generation of kids who grew up watching their parents struggle, right? Now, we also grew up with this idea of education is the most important thing in the world, and it absolutely is and still is. But we also looked at that as a college thing, right? You must go to college and get a piece of paper. Doesn't matter what you get a piece of paper in. It could be basket weaving. It doesn't matter as long as you get a degree, right? One of the things I love doing is going into a room. Education just doesn't work because everyone has a background in education, but go into a business meeting or when I do a presentation at a business commerce kind of convention or a community meeting or something, and I do a presentation, I ask, how many of you are working in the field that you got a degree in? And maybe 3 hands go up, right? Most of us, older people, grew up with this idea that, we end up working in business with a degree in psychology or communication. There wasn't really a tie-in between the degree and what you did professionally, because all you needed to do was show that you went to college. That was the most important element to it. This generation watched their older brothers and sisters do that and then not find a job. They watched them do that and find a job as a barista working at Starbucks and with $200,000 in debt. So this generation thinks about the continuing of education differently. And again, because of technology, we saw college, the place, as where to go learn. And so it's confusing to this generation to think about that, because everything that you can find in college, all the textbooks, all the material, all the research, all the classes really are now online. So this concept of going to college and getting a degree is a little foreign to this generation, because they can get that education just in time and in real time as they're going through their life, right? So they think about that in a different way. They also look at the world in a different way because of what they're experiencing, and the pandemic is just going to add to this, because we grew up, I'm really dating myself here, but I remember the be young, be free, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, Elvis Presley, and well, I'm really dating myself, and all these heroes of like wildness that we had, right? Porky's, Animal House, right? Those were the movies, right? It was all about enjoying life and being free and being young, happy days. This generation is growing up with, hey, the world is dying. Good luck, right? And so they are worried about the world. It's the post 9/11 generation. So this generation is worried about what's happening in the world. They're worried about what planet they're living on. They're worried about environmental factors. As a matter of fact, 67% of them believe that climate change will impact them in their lifetime, right? They believe that, we grew up with this idea of, bullies in school, and they still have bullies in school, but now we have, here in the United States, we have, gun violence in school. So they have to worry about that. So this is a generation that grew up with these ideas that, look, think about it this way. And I love when parents talk about this, right? This generation growing up literally with the world dying, right? Where climate change is a real thing, causing real casualties. They're growing up with, a post 9/11 world where we're paranoid, insecurity, and we're watching everyone, and there's cameras everywhere, and everything that you do is being recorded and online. This generation is growing up with this idea that healthcare is a scarcity and not something that they can just have the way their parents had. They're growing up with equity issues, and are seeing what happened, with George Floyd and race relations, at least here in the United States, and this is true across the world as well. They're growing up with all these things, right? With all these factors, watching iceberg, giant glaciers that have been sitting there for 500 million years just melt and fall into the ocean. And they're seeing all this. They're seeing all the issues in the world. And then we say, oh, it must be their phone that's making them nervous and anxious, right? This is a generation that's growing up worried. So what does that mean for us is that the motivating factors of what is real for them changes. So for example, and my 20-year-old is a great example of this. Again, my generation, our generation, older generation, is a generation of advancement. You went, even school, right? You went to high school, then you went to college, you went to graduate school, then you went and got your job, you paid your dues. I hear this all the time from people in the professional world. That kid didn't pay his dues, right? So you pay your dues for a number of years, and then you move up to a manager role, and then a senior manager role, and then a VP and a senior VP, and then you move up through the ranks. And at the end of all that, you get this package. You get a pension, you get a retirement plan, you get money to go and play golf when you're 65 or 7 years old for the rest of your life. And along that path, your car went from a beat up Chevy Celebrity, that was my first car, to a Toyota Corolla or Camry, to a BMW, to a Mercedes. Like we progressed in our possessions. Our houses went from small houses to bigger houses and bigger houses, right? So that was the motivation and the progression. This generation doesn't see that at all. They don't care about that. That's not what motivates them. That's not what drives them. For the most part, they care more about the experiences that they have, right? And so if you think about social media, so they understand that social media isn't isn't real. They get that. And I get that there's different age groups that understand things at different levels, but most of them understand that what they see on Instagram, what they see on Facebook isn't real. What they're interested in more than anything is the experiences that their friends are having. That's what they care about, is the experiences. So, me telling a young person that I live in a 7,000 square foot home, I don't, on the hills on Camelback Mountain, I don't, and that I drive a Mercedes Benz, I don't. That doesn't impress them. If I tell them that I spent a month living in elephant dung in Africa, that would impress them, right? So experiences are what drive them. And so how do we take education and make it experience-based? How do we take education and create the experiences that this generation wants to have, both in K-12 and in college, right? Like, for example, in college, my college didn't trust me to do an internship until I was a senior. This generation, as soon as they go to college, even before college, they want to do internships. They want to do that. And why that matters is because when you think about where the world is and the things that they care about, and then you think about the world of work, and we talked about the future of work and what that looks like in the future. We talked about that last week. When you put those things together, all of a sudden, it isn't limiting, there's more opportunity, right? When I was a kid, if I wanted to start my own business, I would have to go find a storefront. I would have to go and rent it. I would have to get material. I had to get content for that store. I'd have to go in the community and see what that community needed and make sure that I was putting in inventory that community was going to use for that community. I had to hire people. I had to have supplies. I had to pay rent. I had to do all these things to set up my business and run a business, to be an entrepreneur, if you will. This generation literally can start a business with a click, with a laptop and a click, right? My 7-year-old the other day said that she says these crazy things sometimes. And I'm like, oh my God, that would be so perfect on a t-shirt. She wants to start a t-shirt business. And she could literally go online and start a t-shirt business. Because of technology, work is going to look different. This generation looks at work differently because of the opportunity that technology brings. Has opportunity. They could just pick up a laptop. Now, what that also means is that because they can do that, then they're going to look at work differently. So now look at all these factors. We have a generation of kids who are growing up with watching their parents and their siblings struggle by doing the right thing. They're watching the world fall apart and thinking that, maybe a Mercedes Benz isn't the most important thing to focus on. And because of technology, they can do anything that they want anywhere that they want. And so what's happening is what that causes is exactly what's happening today. When you read the hundreds of articles out there, and I printed one out. I never print things, but I printed this out because I wanted to put it up. But these articles about the Great Resignation and the fact that in 2000 and 2021, more than 47 million people walked away from their jobs. And I know that a lot of that had to do with the pandemic and reevaluating your values and what was important to you. But this generation was already there. And so a lot of that reshuffling, a lot of that you're seeing is from this generation who the pandemic is going to make things even more interesting, where they realize that they can live. My 29-year-old, by the way, works for CNN, makes fake news. My 29-year-old works in New York and lives in Seattle. And because she's talented, she doesn't have to go back to New York. So she's living in Seattle, working in New York, right? We're going to see more of that reshuffling. We're going to see people live where they want to live and work where they want to work. And if it doesn't work out for them, they'll find something else to do because technology has given them the opportunity to do that. So they think about education in a different way when they think about it as in a just-in-time experience, because yes, they value higher education, but they don't value all the fluff that comes with it, right? So So how do we talk to this generation about education, right? So I talked about this last week, right? So this is a problem-solving generation. So many teachers have reached out to me who have gone back to their classrooms, especially for the older kids, right? Those in 6th grade plus, although I would argue that you can do this as early as 1st grade, and ask them, did an exercise on, what problem do you want to solve? Like to really go through that process and thinking about what problem they want to solve, and then how do they want to solve it? And the feedback that I get from educators from that experience is tremendous, right? This generation dives deep into that question, into the problems that they want to solve and what they see and how they want to solve them. Because then we can tie in, and this is the important part, is like, what is it that you need to learn to do that, to solve that problem, to build the knowledge, skills, and abilities that you need to solve that problem. And that's how they look at higher education. They don't look at it as, I need to go to college and take you need to take these 12 required classes. And they're like, why am I taking these classes? And I'm not saying that they're not important classes, because I think a well-rounded, education is important, but they see a lot of fluff. They see a lot of why is it that it takes me 120 credit hours to graduate with a philosophy degree and 120 credit hours to graduate with a computer science degree? How is that possible? How is it both degrees take the same amount of time, right? So they see beyond that. They see that higher education is absolutely critical, but they don't see it the same way we did, which is you go to college and get a piece of paper. They see it as, what classes do I need to take to advance to make me better at what I do, right? That's how they see what they want to be able to focus on. And like I said earlier, they are more than anything interested in experiences and who they are. And then finally, they are, because they're the technology generation, we made an assumption, we talked a little bit about this last week, we made this assumption that they just know how to use technology, that the expectation is that technology is just part of their lives, and therefore they must know how to use it. And all the evidence in the world, and I'd be happy to, if you send me a message, to link you to the Stanford studies that I talked about from a couple years ago, where 80% of elementary school kids couldn't tell you the difference between a sponsored website and a real news site. 1 out of every 4 high school kids that they worked with couldn't pick out the fake story in a group of 4 stories. So I think that we can't assume that just because this generation is born with technology that they know how to use these tools. And so I would start the school year with that. I would start with an assessment of their digital skills and help them, instead of battling them with the technology, help them take that technology and take advantage of it. How do we use that technology? Because like anything, technology can be used for good and it can be used for bad. Like any medicine can be used for good, medicine can be used for bad, fire can be used for good, for bad. Everything has a good and a bad side. And so I think in education, our job isn't just to accept technology as a thing. We actually have to educate them on technology, and not just assume that because they're born with technology that they know how to do this.
All right, good stuff. Jaime, thank you. Food for thought, definitely. And go Sharks.
IAA Sharkast.